Sage Wanderer here, and welcome to Coffee Talk. Hey, you tell me, was the coffee slurping a Sage Wanderer original? Is that? Oh, I got an alfalfa spike. Was that original Sage Wanderer material? Was I the first one to slurp coffee on a YouTube video? Because I feel like Steven Crowder copied me. Was he first? Did I somehow copy Steven Crowder? I think I was slurping coffee first. You hardcore fans, go back and look that up. My first coffee talk happened in 2017. When did Steven Crowder start slurping his coffee at the beginning of his shows? I think he copied me. Anyway, so what are we talking about today? We're talking about global famine. Don't. Are we all going to starve to death? Coffee talks are usually about things that I don't necessarily believe in, but I find interesting. So this coffee talk is more a coffee talk for many of you, because I unfortunately believe the thing I'm about to talk about. The United Nations recently came out with a pronouncement. I do mean recently, I mean just in the last week or two. And they said, and I quote, that a global famine is inevitable and expect the worst global famine in modern history. Don't. If you recall, I started talking about the Ivil Say Orway in this country when in 2017 or 2016, the United Nations think tank came out and said that the United States is in a pre-Civil War condition. That was 5 years ago, and we can see how much it's deteriorated ever since. So when the United Nations says there's going to be a global famine, I tend to listen and I tend to believe. But for you, you might need some coffee to swallow this, but let's treat it like it's a theory, okay? The theory of a global famine being inevitable. Well, we already know that we had supply chain issues thanks to the coffin fit, thanks to the right? And we know that that affected our store shelves. And for most of us who were raised in plenty and having enough, living in the cornucopia that is America and has been up until recent times, we find it really difficult to understand, and it's a little shocking to see our store shelves kind of thin, much less bare. But there could be a time in the near future when stores don't even open but once a week, because that's when the truck comes in. And if you're not in line when the truck comes in, you don't get any food this week. We've already experienced food prices skyrocketing. If you haven't been paying attention, where have you been? I was in the store the other day, and all their candy bars were $2.35 a piece. Their little Hershey's chocolate bars were $2.35 a piece. And I wanted to grab one and hold it up in the store and go, this was $1.35 6 months ago or a year ago. That's been longer than that. A couple years ago, this was $1 something. And when I was a kid, candy bars were 15 cents. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. In 1974, candy bars in the little Oregon town I grew up in cost 15 cents. Ice cream sandwiches were 19 cents. Ask me how I know. I was a fat kid. I love sugar, but it don't love me, right? So we've seen inflation. This is because of supply chain issues, but it's also because of the devaluing of the dollar. What I'm about to describe to you, many of you may already be aware of. You just haven't heard me weigh in on it. Some of you may be waking up to this for the very first time. But what is brewing is the perfect storm for global starvation. We shut the machine down for 2 years. For 2 years nearly, for a year solid across the board, we stopped producing for the most part as a nation and as a world and a global economy. It's ground to a halt. Combine that with a lot of free money coming from the government and people realizing that they can work from home, or that they don't want to go back to the office grind, and they're doing stuff like gig economy stuff. You know, they've just changed their lives because they got a taste of freedom and they stopped being on the 9 to 5 carousel of rat race, the little wheel in the hamster cage. And so that's caused some issues. And then So you've got a lack of workers, you've got stuff being shut down because of lockdowns. We've got import issues already because we can't find dock workers to unload the many containers ships that are still hovering off the coast, slowly but surely getting unloaded. And what you end up with is supply chain issues that have nothing to do with availability at the production level in many cases. But our production was also shut down in some cases for up to 2 years. We've seen things like basic food items double in price, especially processed foods. Processing plants went to skeleton crews. They reduced the amount of product they were producing. And we've seen all of that happen. But now, even when you think things couldn't get worse, now we have this war in Ukraine. Let me tell you something about that part of Ukraine and Russia. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but a significant portion of the wheat produced in the world comes from that region. It's a breadbasket. It's a major breadbasket, and it's on fire. And the port, I mean, it's in the middle of a war. They're not planting in Ukraine right now. Okay, that's not happening this spring. They're fighting for their lives. Their cities are getting destroyed. They're in survival mode, and they are not planting for next year. So Ukrainian wheat is not coming. Okay. And I heard somewhere that between Russia and Ukraine, it's like 30% of our wheat production. Everything's got bread in it. I'm gluten intolerant, and I shy away and avoid breads. But I gotta say, everything's got bread in it, right? Just try eating a keto diet. You end up throwing away bread. I got, I always get Texas toast if I order some fast food from some of my favorite Texas restaurants like Whataburger or Sonic, but it goes right in the dumpster for me because I can't eat it. But everything's got bread on it. Everything's a sandwich, everything's breaded. So, what happens when flour becomes hard to come by? How will that affect our diets? How will that affect the overall calories available for people? Not to mention the prices, supply and demand. It's economics 101. If you got 10 people that want the same item, it's worth $10, 10 times more what it would be worth if one person wanted the item, right? That the more demand, the higher the prices. And then you have the economic sanctions that we've levied against Russia. And now, I trust me, what's probably next, and I'm pretty good at predicting this stuff, is that China has thrown in with Russia and clearly decided what side they're on. And now Biden's going to feel obligated to extend all of these economic sanctions that are on Russia now onto China as well. And what we're basically doing is splitting the world in half. And in so many ways, we had, Bill Clinton brought us the global economy. If you recall, those of you that were alive and of age to remember that that was the big selling point for him. We're transitioning to an international or global economy. Well, the problem with that is that you rely on other nations to provide for you and to trade with you, and you're not self-sufficient. You're not an independent nation. You can't then survive on your own very easily because you become dependent on these foreign countries and what they can do for you and the trading partnerships that you have. And so when the world starts getting divided in half over an issue like what's happening in Ukraine, you know, uh, we've got China, obviously, Russia, Iran has sided with them. The Saudis are going to start taking the yen. That's another thing. The petroleum dollar. We're going to talk about the petrodollar in a minute. But when you start dividing up the world economy, now you're living on half of what you had before when you reduced your trading partners by half over some conflict. Now we can only trade with European nations. We can only trade with friendly nations in South America and Australia and Canada. And our trade with Russia and China is going to come to a grinding halt. And you're already seeing a devastation on our economy. The dollar is crashing. And now Saudi Arabia, here's the petrodollar thing, is saying that they're no longer going to trade oil in dollars. They're going to trade oil in the yen or the yuan, the Chinese dollar. And I read a book written 20 years ago about this thick on what would happen to America if that happened. If Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates decided to switch their trading from the dollar to any other foreign currency, that it would destroy the American economy. And there's a whole lot of math whiz, high-end economics that I don't want to try to explain to you how that works. But let's just say Saudi Arabia trading in American dollars for oil is what's kept our dollar strong my entire life, for most of my life. And if OPEC, and especially the Saudis, if they start trading in the yen for their oil instead of the dollar will become worth much less. I won't say it will become worth less, but it will begin to really crumble. And we've already seen the dollar falling. The economic sanctions are a two-edged sword. It's like a big handgun. It kills on one end and wounds on the other, right? And so we have punished Russia, but at the same time, by our own president's own words, we are paying the price for that. Well, the price is inflation. The price, and they're blaming it on Putin, but whatever, it's the situation. We were already dealing with it because of COVID, and we were already dealing with it because of lockdowns and because of and it's just a lot of factors that were leading us to have a lot of inflation issues. We're suffering from a thing known as stagflation. I read another book this thick, written 20 years ago, on what stagflation would do. Once it gets started, it's almost impossible to stop. And a quick synopsis of what stagflation is: it's stagnation in the economy for whatever reason, coupled with soaring prices and inflation and a drop of the dollar. And that it's kind of a snowball from hell that you can't stop. That once it gets started, you can't get it back. It's hard to get it undone. And so we're definitely fully down the road of stagflation right now, and it's just going to get worse. And so we've cut ourselves off from these trading partners. The sanctions are sanctioning them, but at a cost of our own pocketbook. We've seen gas prices erupt. Diesel prices are off the chain. That's going to drive inflation even more. It's like pouring gasoline on a fire. It's a perfect storm. Stick your head between your legs and kiss your butt goodbye. Ah! Gotta laugh to keep from crying, right? So now let's talk about fertilizer. Who would have known that the coin of the realm of the zombie apocalypse would be poop? I got a stack of poop out here in my chicken pen that I've been thinking for a long time to get cleaned up and get moved out. But fertilizer and diesel fuel is what feeds you. If you want to know where your food comes from today, it doesn't come from some farmer with a pitchfork. It comes from a major corporation with a mile-long convoy of tractors that run on diesel, growing food that is raised on chemical fertilizers that are made out of various substances that are basically petroleum derived. So higher gas prices means higher fertilizer prices. Now, we already found out that, like 30% of the world's wheat is made in Ukraine and Russia, and now we don't have access to that. Well, guess what the number one and number two leaders of fertilizer ingredients export? Russia and Ukraine. That's where the fertilizer comes from. That's where the urea comes from that you use to make not just fertilizer, but it's also a component of explosives and gunpowder. So they're sitting on the biggest stockpiles, the biggest sources of urea and the components of chemical fertilizer, and now we don't have access to that. So you're going to see chemical fertilizers, ammonium nitrate fertilizer, become unaffordable. And already we're hearing from agricultural sources right now that this spring planting is going to be much less because they can't afford to plant the acreage they have, because it won't pay off because they can't get the fertilizer at an affordable cost. So in lieu of chemical fertilizers, you're stuck with organic fertilizers, which consist of animal excrement, bat guano, horse poop, right? I got chicken poop and rabbit poop in my place. And then fertilizers you can make out of organic sources, like using waste from corn and the process of sorghum and all of that to create a organic plant-based fertilizer. And so, but your yields are going to be significantly less. Chemical fertilizers grow plants like crazy. It's like the Miracle Grow commercials, right? This stuff really works. And without it, we can't produce the kind of food here in America or around the globe that we could before. So we've cut off some global trade partners that possess things that we've become dependent upon, and they're directly related to our food production. We already had food shortages because of processing plants shutting down for COVID and running on skeleton crews. It's why bacon became $9 and $10 for a while for a 12-ounce container of bacon, right? And those prices dropped a little bit when the lockdowns lifted and people went back to work to some degree. Um, but the next phase is going to be in actually acquiring the components it takes to process food. So flour is what runs this world. We run on wheat and oil. And those are two things now that are going to become extremely expensive. And when Saudi Arabia switches to using the yen, if they follow through with the threat and do this, it's not set in stone yet, but it looks like that's what they're going to do. They're siding with the other side, essentially, economically. And when that happens, every economist that I've ever studied, any futurist that's ever looked at the issue, says when America loses the petrodollar, it crashes, the dollar crashes. The Bible talks about us having to work a week for a day's worth of food or something like that. And you're going to see that happening because prices already are going up faster than your wages can compensate for them. And at least I can say that DoorDash, who I've been working for, has they've compensated their drivers. They went to if you use their credit card to make your gas purchases, you get 10% cash back right off the top. So instead of paying $3.79 here, I'm paying what don't make me do the math in the morning, $3.30 or whatever a gallon when the smoke clears and I get my cash back, which happens instantly as soon as I gas up. I immediately get cash back into my account, so it's like I didn't spend it. And they're also giving you, if you're a mostly full-time driver, at least you get above a certain number of miles in a week, which I surpass greatly. I do a lot of deliveries. I work a lot. I work 6 days this week. I put in about a 50-hour work week this week, and I'm having to dig myself out from my romantic misadventures. So anyway, yeah, the pay doesn't keep up. DoorDash is doing their best to make up for the gas prices because gas is such a huge investment when you're a gig economy person, you're driving all the time. That it was killing people. They were having to quit DoorDash and get a closer regular job so they didn't have to spend the money on gas. But DoorDash is trying to make an adjustment there. But most companies can't adjust their wages enough to make up for the inflation and the higher cost of living. And that especially is true with fuel and food. Now, there's another element to talk about here. People that have studied historically, they've studied wars, they've studied periods of unrest. Biden recently came out and basically said we're going into a period of war, that cyclically through time, we seem to keep repeating these patterns. I'm being way more articulate than the child sniffer would. He stumbled his way through it. It was kind of pathetic. But ultimately, what he was saying is we're entering into a season of turmoil. And that means you're going to have to man up. That means things are going to get hard, things are going to get tough, and we have to commit ourselves to this long-term fight with Russia. Right? This is World War III on top of all this stuff we've been talking about. And war has a way of crushing an economy. And in times past, I can say the American people have manned up. They've cowboyed up, but there ain't a lot of cowboys left in the world, right? There are not a lot of men left in the world. And, I don't know how much this generation can man up, how much they can, be strong and work through it. But typically war will kind of pull you out of a Great Depression, right? Because it forces you to become productive. People work harder and accept less pay, and it all equals to a boost in the economy. That's unless you lose, right? And then you're a vassal state, right? Then you work for whatever economic system is put on you. All of this adds up to a perfect storm, and you add war to it, and rationing's coming, a draft is coming, um, potentially an EMP. I could do a whole video on where if I was Putin and I was looking for a way to demolish the United States without ever actually killing one human. It's the only use of nuclear weapons you're going to get away with in this modern time without a massive retaliation. America says they would retaliate with nuclear weapons against anyone who attacks their electrical infrastructure with an EMP or a hack or any other thing. It would be hard pressed in the court of public opinion to start blowing up Russian cities because they turned off our electricity. But if you understand modern society, and the people that wargame this says that 90% of the United States population would perish if we had a 3 to 5 year blackout. And an EMP set up right over my head here, center of the country, right here in Oklahoma, smack dab in the middle of the continental United States. That's where they do it, right overhead, and everything from coast to coast would stop working overnight. It would be a total blackout, not just of electricity, but you couldn't even create electricity. The chipsets in your generators wouldn't work. Your car wouldn't stop. What you have is what you have. What you can get is what you can walk to or ride a bicycle or a horse to. They could do that to the United States and claim innocence, or even blame it on a rogue state, or say they don't know who did it. And it would be hard for us to just nuke Russia because we got our lights put out, when it could be hackers. It could be, proving that enough to kind of socially justify a nuclear holocaust in retaliation would be tough. I think Putin could EMP the United States and for the most part get away with it. Some people say Putin is dying of cancer, that he has inoperable terminal cancer and he's dying, and that he wants to go out with a bang. He wants to become a world dictator. And this is the beginning of it. I don't know if there's any truth in that or not. I do know if I were Putin and any of that were true, an EMP's got to be at the top of the list. So if the lights went out tomorrow and your car didn't drive, what would you do? It's hard to think about. There's a normalcy bias in everyone, even in preppers right now. We can't believe the things we're seeing happening, right? And at the same time, we find it really hard to swallow what could happen. But just because something like this hasn't happened in our lifetime doesn't mean it's never happened, and doesn't mean it isn't just as likely to happen. I mean, you have to look at the totality of circumstances, and you have to put your normalcy bias on hold. Look at it from a third party perspective and go, what does this look like from the outside? And when you do that, honestly, if I were you, I'd take every ounce of money I could get and I would start stacking food under my bed. Buy 5-gallon buckets full of flour. Buy as much sugar as you can lay your hands on. Sugar's a forever food, right? Flour can last 20 years easily. It would definitely last in a bucket for 10 years if you keep it out of the light and out of the moisture and keep it dry. Honey is a forever food. Rice and beans last for decades if stored properly. I wouldn't even at this point waste my time on long-term freeze-dried survival food, because you don't need it to last 30 years. You just need the next 7 years. And I will remind you of something I mentioned on this channel. It's been about 4 years ago when I said this, that for whatever it's worth, and you may need a lot of coffee to swallow this idea, but I heard the voice of God speak to me, and he said, prepare for a 7-year famine. So I sat down and I calculated how much bulk groceries, how much food I would need as a one person to store up enough food for 7 years. And I realized I did not have the storage space nor the financial capacity to just store up food for 7 years. But there's more than one way to skin a cat. There's more than one way to provide for your family for 7 years of famine. You don't have to put up stores of food, although having a head start in deep larders, having a full pantry, having a head start on the world, having a store of modern food put up for a while is a great head start. But ultimately, no one's going to have 7 years of food. Just so very few people. The storage of that much food alone is a huge commitment. But a lifestyle of self-sustenance. How did our ancestors survive before all of this? If we were to get EMP'd back to the horse and buggy days, how did they do it? Well, they did it by the sweat of their brow. They did it with manpower, horsepower, and basic machinery, right? Rudimentary engineering, right? And small livestock husbandry, chickens, eggs, rabbit meat. Rabbits proliferate. You can feed them from the grass that grows up every summer. Getting them through the winter takes a little preparation. You got to have some food put up because once grass dries out, it's not nutrient unless you cut it while it was green and then let it dry. So hay, right? Putting up hay, even you have to hand cut it and put in old-fashioned haystacks. Remember, like the old cartoon haystacks, finding a needle in a haystack? They didn't bale it. They cut it by hand. They piled it up with pitchforks, and they let it dry naturally, right? Let dry laying flat, and then took the dried hay and piled it up into haystacks. That's what you have to do. That's what you have to do. That being able to produce food reliably is a much more reliable way of making sure you survive a famine than storing up food, because your stores can be confiscated by the government, and in times of war that happens. That just happens. So if you do stash food, it needs to be very secretive. It needs to be off the grid. You need to pay cash for it, and you need to hide it in a place that no one can easily find it, right? And a rudimentary search of your property wouldn't produce it. But if you're raising livestock, if you're growing food, hey, they'll come along and want a piece of your grow, but they won't shut you down because you're producing, right? So being self-sufficient, being able to essentially pay your taxes in eggs and meat, if so required in an emergency, is how people survived for thousands of years. That's the way humans normally live. This is a aberration. This modern technological world is it's a mutation, right? It's not the norm. And so I urge you to build your skills, hunt, fish, plant a garden, raise chickens, raise rabbits, put in a cow. If you like milk, get a milk cow or some milk goats. I don't drink milk, so that's not on my agenda. And store up basic things like flour, sugar, baking soda, rice, beans, and as much canned meat as you can afford with the prices going through the roof, if you can even find them. I haven't had Wolf brand chili available in my local stores for about a month now. I'm not happy about that. I don't like other chilies. And guess what? You're lucky to find any chili in stores in Oklahoma, because chili is essentially canned meat. And I'm talking chili without beans. I'm talking just hamburger in a tomato sauce, essentially. So it's telling me already that for all of these reasons, food is already getting scarce. It's going to get more scarce. It's going to get more expensive. Inflation is going to explode. And I don't need coffee to prove that to me, but you might need some coffee to swallow it. So this is a weird coffee talk, not coffee talk. But are we on the verge of global starvation? Is this how the Georgia Guidestones become a reality? Is this how they get their 90% depopulation? Everyone starves. These people that live in these caves, they call home offices and bedrooms, where they're surrounded by computers and they never come out. They all look like zombies or vampires. How are they going to do when they have to live like men used to have to live? When they have to actually work and sweat to make their food and to find their way? God help us all with what's coming. We'll see you next time on Coffee Talk.